This is a Black Dog Woof Woof production, written and reported by me, John Sweeney. Hello to everyone out there who's listened to all 12 episodes of Taking on Putin. You've got a treat in store, a one-off bonus edition. Everything you wanted to know about Vladimir Putin's sex life, but were afraid to ask. This is an extract from my audiobook, Killer in the Kremlin. If you listen, the Kremlin won't like it. Chapter 8. One Lump or Two. It's the summer of 2006, and Vladimir Putin gets out of his motorcade and walks towards the Kremlin. Every now and then he likes to play folksy leader, at one with and at ease with the narod, the Russian people. On his walkabout he spots a blonde Russian boy who looks 5 years old, if that, and kneels before him. Putin lifts up the boy's shirt and kisses him on the stomach. You can watch a video on YouTube, just search for Putin kisses a boy on stomach. It is creepy. Very. I ask a Russian woman for her reaction, whether this was a Russian thing. She replies, "I was shocked. It's not a Russian thing, it's totally wrong. It's absolutely not in Russian culture. Okay, Russians, after maybe one bottle of vodka, they become more friendly. But not like this." The name of my Russian friend is Marina Litvinenko, and her husband was Alexander Sasha Litvinenko, a former colonel in the KGB FSB. What he made of the video of Putin kneeling down and kissing the little boy on the stomach, and the Kremlin's reaction to it, created headlines around the world. But to work out what happened, we need to understand the back history of the strange relationship between the two former KGB officers, Putin and Litvinenko. A career officer in the Secret Service, Litvinenko, when the Soviet Union imploded, stayed with the renamed FSB, working in its branch dealing with organized crime. He came across repeated instances of his fellow FSB officers working for and being paid off by organized crime. Straight, moral, incorruptible, Litvinenko was disgusted by the sleaze and went out of his way to write detailed, lengthy reports on it and set them on the desks of his bosses. Time and again, his efforts to clean up his own service came to naught. If your partner cheated you, or a creditor did not pay up, or a supplier did not deliver, where did you turn to complain? When force becomes a commodity, there was always demand for it. Protection rackets, in Russian krysha, literally roof, appeared. People who sheltered and protected your business. First, it was provided by the mob, then by police, and soon even our own guys realized what was what. And then the rivalry began amongst gangsters, cops, and the agency, the FSB, for market share. As the police and the FSB became more competitive, they squeezed the gangs out of the market. However, in many cases competition gave way to cooperation, and the security services became gangsters themselves. This is exactly what Yuri Shcherkachikin warned about before his skin started to peel off. In 1994, Berezovsky, the Russian oligarch who later on invested heavily in Vladimir Putin as a potential successor to Yeltsin, was making a fortune by importing foreign cars, much to the dismay of Russian car makers. The solution was to blow up his car. His driver died, but the oligarch survived, and Litvinenko investigated the assassination plot. Berezovsky was grateful for Litvinenko's honesty and tenacity, and the two men hit it off. In 1998, Berezovsky, ever the power broker, introduced Litvinenko to Vladimir Putin, whom he'd just helped become the new boss of the FSB. Berezovsky said, "Go see Putin, make yourself known, see what a great guy we've installed, with your help." Litvinenko reported to Putin on the scale of corruption inside the FSB. His current investigation was how FSB officers were providing roof for Uzbek drug barons, but it was like pissing on marble. Litvinenko told his wife Marina after the meeting, "I could see in his eyes that he hated me." In November 1998, Litvinenko and 4 other FSB officers in the organised crime branch held a press conference, denouncing corruption inside the service and saying that they had been ordered to kill and kidnap prominent Russians. It was the kind of thing that early on in the Yeltsin years would have been just part of the rough and tumble of a new and energetic democracy. But now the mood had soured, and Putin sacked his troublesome agent. Later, Putin said, "I fired Litvinenko and disbanded his unit because FSB officers should not stage press conferences. This is not their job, and they should not make internal scandals public." The writing was on the wall, not just for Litvinenko, but also for his old mentor, Berezovsky. In 2000, Litvinenko got out to Turkey, tried to claim political asylum with the Americans, who turned him down, then flew to London, where the British showed more nous. Effectively, Litvinenko defected to MI6. The British Secret Service spirited Marina and their son out, so by summer 2006, the Litvinenkos were living in Alexandra Palace, Ali Pali, in North London. In exile in London too was Berezovsky, who helped fund Litvinenko's research into corruption in the highest levels of the Russian secret state, up to, and of course including, Putin himself. There's a clip of Litvinenko talking about what it is like to be on the run from the FSB, which appeared on our BBC Panorama in 2007. "It's like a free-fall parachute jump. It's only terrifying when you're jumping from the plane when you look down, but after you jump there isn't much you can do. You're in free-fall. You can't go back. You can only go down." Sasha Litvinenko was, in Putin's eyes, a traitor to the KGB, to the fatherland, to everything the master of the Kremlin held dear. When Putin kissed the boy on the stomach, Litvinenko wrote in his blog, from the safety of Ali Pali, that Vladimir Putin is a paedophile. Litvinenko's blog is set out in full in Sir Robert Owen's report into the affair. The former KGB colonel claimed that Putin has been secretly filmed in the same flat where Skaratov was compromised with 2 women prostitutes, but in Putin's case, it was him with young boys. Litvinenko said the authorities at the KGB-run Andropov Institute hushed up the scandal, but decided not to send Putin, a fluent German speaker, to the West. Years later, Litvinenko claimed, when Putin became the director of the FSB in 1998, he went hunting for the secret files on him. Litvinenko blogged, he began to seek and destroy any compromising materials collected against him by the secret services over earlier years. It was not difficult, provided he himself was the FSB director. Among other things, Putin found videotapes in the FSB Internal Security Directorate, which showed him making sex with some underage boys. If you dare to say that about Vladimir Putin, nowhere is safe. Nowhere on earth. For the record, the kissing of the boy on the stomach is deeply unpleasant and extraordinarily peculiar. But aside from that incident, there is no clear, verifiable evidence that Putin is a paedophile. Litvinenko provided none in his blog. By this point, Litvinenko and his financial and moral backer, Berezovsky, hated Putin. Hate is the enemy of good intelligence. You need to be able to step back, to assess what you've got and what you haven't, and call it. Journalism requires the same skill set. What gets a story over the line is multiple sources standing it up. Here we've only Litvinenko's word for it, that the FSB Internal Security Directorate had compromised tapes on Putin. That does not mean that his claim is inherently untrue. Putin's sexuality, like so much else about him, remains opaque. It's just that to stay credible in intelligence and journalism, you have to be able to supply evidence to back up your story. If you don't, people start to cross the other side of the street to ignore you. That's what happened to Litvinenko. His claim without supporting evidence got little traction in the West. But the Kremlin took note. Paul M. Joyle is an American expert on the Russian secret state and former director of security to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He knows the Kremlin secret corridors very well and was a good friend of Litvinenko and another former KGB officer, retired Major General Oleg Kalugin. The youngest Major General in the history of the Soviet KGB, Kalugin was high up in the Foreign Counterintelligence section, responsible for penetrating foreign intelligence services worldwide. In July 2006, Litvinenko sent his draft blog calling Putin a paedophile by fax to Kalugin, who immediately shared it with Joyle. Both of them live in the Washington, D.C. area. Litvinenko's draft blog analyzed Putin's faltering trajectory at the start of his KGB career. Joyle provided me with a succinct summary. Litvinenko said, if you look closely at the blank spots, including Putin's biography, you can find an explanation for his stalled career early on. When he graduated from the Andropov Institute, which trains officers for the KGB, Putin was first sent to a junior position in the Leningrad Directorate of the KGB. For a graduate of the Andropov Institute, fluent in German, this is a very unusual turn. Something happened shortly before he graduated, people who studied with him say. The authorities caught a piece of the real Vladimir Putin, that he was a paedophile. Rather than start a full investigation, which could, of course, have caused a scandal, it was easier to come up with an excuse not to send Putin abroad. Many years later, when Putin became head of the FSB, he began to seek out and destroy the evidence collected against him. So that's what the blog says. Litvinenko's draft facts refer to someone else on the trail of, in his words, Putin's sexual perversion years before. Litvinenko wrote that the reporter Artyom Borovik published a story on Putin the paedophile, and 1 week after publication, he died in mysterious circumstances. Borovik died in early March 2000, a few weeks before Russia voted Putin into office as president. He was killed along with the passengers and crew, 9 people in all, of a private jet taking off from Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport. The official explanation was that the jet had not been de-iced properly, but the weather was not fiercely cold. Many suspected he had been killed by the secret state, but this was because he had been investigating the mystery surrounding Putin's birth, that he was a bastard, and not, as Litvinenko claimed in the draft facts, because he knew the paedophile angle. For some reason, Litvinenko dropped the claim about Borovik knowing the paedophile allegation in the blog that he finally published. Joyle recalls, now, of course, Alexander Litvinenko and Boris Berezovsky were involved in a kind of war with Vladimir Putin. After seeing this document Alexander was about to publish, Oleg Kalugin and I expressly told him not to do it. We said that this is way too personal, and there really isn't enough to warrant the accusation of paedophilia, as shocking as the incident was. The thing that worried Joyle and Kalugin was the risk Litvinenko was taking if he ran the paedophile allegation. Litvinenko's blog was an extremely personal insult and a personal attack. And to make this attack on a head of state of a country like Russia was, of course, extremely dangerous. And, to tell you the truth, one that few people took seriously. That is true. The Western world ignored Litvinenko's blog. Moscow did not. That summer, the Russian parliament, the Duma, passed a new law allowing the state to kill any extremist who defamed the president. Joyle said, it provided justification for extreme measures. In plain English, assassination. Joyle believes that control over people is the thing that rocks Putin's boat. This is in line, by the way, with lifting up the shirt and kissing a boy on the belly. I can do this, so I'm going to do it. The intelligence analyst says that he's not a professional psychologist, but a student of human behavior. Litvinenko did not listen to his friend's warning and press publish on his blog. That November 2006, he drank tea with two Russians in the Millennium Hotel in Mayfair. It was a case of one lump or two. He came home to Ali Pali, and then a few hours later he told Marina, "I feel sick." He started vomiting, and once he started, he could not stop. Immediately he told Marina, "This is chemical poison." She could not believe that anyone would do this to him. They called an ambulance, and the paramedics told him that it looked like seasonal flu. Marina takes up the story. The next day, it was the start of November. He became even worse, vomiting blood. 3 days later, he was admitted to Barnet Hospital, but the doctors didn't realize what or who they were dealing with. When Sasha first asked them, "Would you check me for poison?" they looked at him as if he was a crazy man. I remember I went to see him and he said, "Marina, they don't trust us." Litvinenko was moved to University College Hospital, where some of the best doctors in London remained baffled. Marina told me, "I noticed his hair when I touched his head. A great lump of hair would fall off in my hand. I said, 'Sasha, what is this?' He said, 'I don't know.' And I did it again, and again a great lump of his hair was in my hand. His skin started to blister. His white blood count was very low. But he was determined to help the police nail his killers, telling the detectives about his last movements, helping then investigate his own murder. As he lay dying, Litvinenko issued a statement, his last testament. "You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protest from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life." On the last day he could speak, Marina, exhausted, was about to head home to look after their son when Sasha told her, "Marina, I love you so much." That night he lost consciousness and never recovered. The last photograph of Alexander Litvinenko shows him entirely bald, in green hospital pajamas, monitoring tabs on his bare chest, staring defiantly at the camera. For the Taking on Putin podcast, I set out to talk to someone who knows a thing or two about radioactive poisons. Ever the skeptical reporter, I probed my source. "Sweeney, have you passed an O-level?" Norman Dombey, "1 or 2. I'm Professor Emeritus of Theoretical Physics at the University of Sussex." Sweeney, "Before that, where did you get your degree?" Dombey, "I got my first degree at Oxford." Sweeney, "They give them away." Dombey, "I have a doctorate from Caltech." Sweeney, "In theoretical physics?" Dombey, "Theoretical physics, and my supervisor was Murray Gell-Mann, who won the Nobel Prize and invented quarks." Then he cracked open a can of Spitfire beer. Norman Dombey knows his stuff. The professor was an expert witness for Marina Litvinenko at the public inquiry into her husband's poisoning, which took place a full 9 years after he was assassinated, because the British government considered good relations with the Kremlin to be more important than investigating the killing of a British citizen with a weapon of mass destruction. The biggest mystery was how come the doctors could not work out what had happened to Litvinenko. His hair falling out, his skin falling off, a horrible way to die, but common symptoms of radioactive poisoning. They tested his blood with a Geiger counter for radiation. I asked Professor Norman Dombey, what happened? Nothing. There was no reading, so it wasn't radiation. No, it was radiation. But it wasn't radiation which was detectable by a Geiger counter. Geiger counters detect the kinds of radiation that affect us nearly all the time: gamma and beta. But there is a third kind, alpha radiation, and that the Geiger counter cannot detect. The Russian poison factory had pulled off a fiendishly clever trick. It wasn't the kind of radiation that people normally think about. And then someone smart worked it out. Britain is a bit rubbish in many ways. It rains too much, the food is grim, Brexit. But we do love a puzzle. Sherlock Holmes wore a silly hat and had superhuman powers of detection. But he was very, very British, and someone a bit like the resident of 221B Baker Street cracked the puzzle, and by doing so, fucked the Kremlin. The person, or more likely the team, that solved the Litvinenko poison problem works at Aldermaston, Britain's nuclear bomb factory in Berkshire. Professor Dombey explained that the doctors at University College Hospital thought, "This is strange. It looks like radiation, but we can't measure the radiation." And then they sent the samples from Litvinenko's body fluids to Aldermaston. They did some tests looking for particular nuclear decays. And they found too, alpha radiation of a particular energy and also gamma radiation, which was much weaker. The two results led to only one finding. They identified the isotope as polonium-210. "Can you buy polonium-210 in a shop?" I asked the long-suffering prof. No. The thing about poison as a murder weapon is that it can tell you something about the poisoner more than you might think. Polonium is a radioactive element, which the brilliant physicist Marie Curie first discovered and named after her home country, Poland. Radioactive elements have different isotopes, so there is a polonium-186 and 201 and more. Think of isotopes like salad dressings, Thousand Island, honey mustard, garlic. Polonium-210 is like garlic. It's very distinctive. More, the dose used to kill Litvinenko was extraordinarily high. Dombey said he swallowed an astonishing 26.5 micrograms. Dombey did some of his own detective work and concluded definitively that the polonium-210 which killed Litvinenko could only have come from the Avangard nuclear reactor in the city of Sarov, 450 miles southeast of Moscow. By the way, if this is triggering Lord of the Rings flashbacks, I'm not making names like Avangard and Sarov up. Nowhere else makes the polonium-210 garlic flavour, if you like, by the necessary bucket load, with the exquisite purity. The professor took me through the different steps which led to the killer cuppa. First, he said, the Mayak nuclear reactor in the Urals irradiated bismuth, a metal known to the ancients, a sister to lead and tin. The radioactive bismuth was then transported to the Avangard reactor in Sarov and converted into polonium-210. Next, some kind of Russian state poison factory converted it from metal to soluble, so it could end up in a cup of tea. "How sure are you of this?" I asked Professor Dombey. 99.99%. More nines on this, if you like. The prof had earned his Spitfire beer. Diffident, softly spoken, Norman Dombey is a hero of our time. The Russian secret state thought they had deployed the ultimate stealth poison. They were wrong about that. Once the British scientists work out it was polonium-210, then following the trail of the poisoners was like following a burglar's footsteps in the snow. There were 3 prime suspects for the poisoning, all of whom met Litvinenko in the afternoon and early evening before he fell ill. They are Mario Scaramella, a rather loopy Italian intelligence analyst come conspiracy theorist who goes to a sushi bar with Litvinenko on Piccadilly, and 2 Russians, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun. They're in town for the game between Arsenal and CSKA Moscow. They're on the gin. Litvinenko has a cuppa. For our BBC Panorama programme, How to Poison a Spy, I followed the polonium-210 trail in January 2007. At lunchtime, the 1st of November 2006, Litvinenko catches the 134 bus into town. No trace of polonium on his ticket or the bus. He's still clean. The Itsu Sushi Bar, Piccadilly, contaminated. But no polonium where Litvinenko and Scaramella sit. That's odd. An anomaly. Is Scaramella a red herring? Then the trail goes backwards in time. 2 weeks before, on the 16th of October, Lugovoy, once a KGB officer, now a millionaire, and his friend Dmitry Kovtun, a porn star turned KGB agent, are staying at the Parks Hotel in Knightsbridge. 2 rooms at the hotel are tested for polonium. The result? Contaminated. The polonium trail begins for sure. Itsu Sushi Bar in Piccadilly is one of Litvinenko's haunts. During the October trip, Lugovoy and Kovtun meet Litvinenko for lunch at Itsu Sushi Bar in Piccadilly. The restaurant is contaminated, but not at the same seats which Scaramella and Litvinenko would use 2 weeks later. Scaramella is a red herring. On the 25th of October, Lugovoy returns to London and checks in at the Sheraton Park Lane Hotel. He meets Litvinenko 2 or 3 times during this trip. One room at the hotel is left a radioactive mess. In January 2007, not just one room but a whole section of the 8th floor corridor is still boarded up. On the 28th of October 2006, Lugovoy flies back to Russia on British Airways flight GBNWX. And you've guessed it, at least one seat on the plane contaminated. On the same day, Kovtun arrives in Hamburg and sees his children, a toddler and a baby, who live with his ex-wife. They are contaminated. Lugovoy and Kovtun next meet with Litvinenko on the day he's poisoned, at 4:30 p.m. in the Pine Bar of the Millennium Hotel, just an hour after the sushi bar. This is when the polonium trail gets really hot. Lugovoy and Kovtun are drinking with a third Russian, Vyacheslav Sokolenko. Business was done for the day, and they were relaxing ahead of the game. Litvinenko doesn't touch alcohol, but he'll always have a cuppa. Marina told me, in Millennium Hotel, Sasha told me, he met Lugovoy and during this meeting he drank tea. And he said the tea was already served on the table, and he just took this cup of tea and didn't finish it all. Later he said the tea wasn't very tasty. The polonium trail across London proves that Litvinenko's tea had been laced with polonium-210. The dose was massive. We estimated 4 billion becquerels of radiation. The normal level in the body is just 20 becquerels. The contamination trail at the Pine Bar is astounding. The cup that contained the tea, contaminated. The 7 bar staff at the hotel who took the cup away, washed it, wiped it, set it out for other guests, contaminated. The Pine Bar itself contaminated, and was still closed 2.5 months on. Contamination isn't necessarily lethal because alpha particles don't jump about. They are lethal if you ingest them, but long-term risks are not known. Lugovoy and Kovtun go to the match. Seats at the Emirates Stadium contaminated. Everything points to not one but multiple attempts to kill Litvinenko. The polonium trail makes Lugovoy and Kovtun prime suspects for the assassination. They deny it, blah, blah, blah. You can make the argument that a rich man like Lugovoy could have got hold of the polonium-210 under the counter, as it were. I asked Professor Donald Rayfield whether it could be an oligarch or another actor in the Russian secret state. Rayfield replied, "If you think that, you have to totally ignore the way the Russian state or any dictatorship works. Nothing important happens to anyone outside that might have international consequence without the direct orders and consent of the head of state, any more than it would in North Korea or in China. These loose cannons have been eliminated in Russia. It does not happen. One businessman might order another businessman to be killed, but it's more likely that he will report him to the tax authorities and they will extort his wealth. But murder with a radioactive substance, which can only come from one source, would cost millions even for the state to isolate, to bring, to pack, to train the assassins. It's inconceivable that this wasn't done on Putin's direct orders. For our Panorama program, I went off to Moscow and St. Petersburg, asking anyone who'd talk to me about my favourite question: can you buy polonium-210 in a shop? My then girlfriend, Tomiko Newsom, later my wife, later my ex, but we're still pals, popped into Moscow to do some shopping if anyone was following her. She played the part beautifully and secretly shipped home our footage. One night we sang Land of Hope and Glory in our room in the Hotel Ukraina, something I'd never dream of doing in London. Panorama bid for, and I got to interview Putin's all-powerful press officer, Dmitry Peskov, in the Kremlin. BBC Current Affairs never has enough money to do things, so I recall I did this interview with a freelance camera operator, but no staff producer. To be honest, when I rocked up to the Kremlin's mighty red walls, walked through a gate, and the door closed quietly behind me, my heart did flutter a little. Peskov's got a suggestion of a mullet, boasts a centipede for a moustache, and has a rather mournful air, suggesting a forlorn football manager of, say, a down table, Rotherham United. His English is fluent, softly spoken. He is stiletto, not sabre. He lies so beautifully. I put it to Peskov that Litvinenko had blogged that Putin was a paedophile, and then he dies. Putin did kiss the boy on the stomach. Is Putin a paedophile? I asked. No, said Peskov, flatly. You could tell from his eyes that he did not like the question one little bit. The BBC cut out that question. To be fair, I did not think that Litvinenko had proved his claim, and I didn't have a big row with BBC management about that edit then. Now, I would. I cited the book Blowing Up Russia by Litvinenko and Faustinski, in which Putin was accused outright of being behind the Moscow apartment bombings, and then the co-author gets poisoned in London. Is that story true? I asked Peskov. He replied, no, it is not true. What he wrote in that book blaming Putin, the FSB, for blowing up these apartments in Russia has nothing to do with the reality. Actually, I mean, again, in my personal opinion, this is, let's say, a product of an ill brain. Peskov laughed quietly. I don't know a proper English word for that. Sweeney, a sick brain. Peskov, yes, sick brain. Sick brain, I mean it's... Sweeney, mentally ill? Peskov, well, in my understanding, only a mentally ill person can think about Russian government blowing up homes of its own people. Marina Litvinenko has told me, I can't say exactly that Putin killed Sasha, but I can say that Putin is behind everything that happens in Russia. I put that to Peskov and he replied, and I answered directly, Russia has not done that. And it is absurd even to think about that. Sweeney, and she's a liar for saying so. Peskov, in these words, yes. Sweeney, she's a liar? Peskov, yes. If she says that Russia has killed Sasha, she's a liar in these words. Sweeney, she's safe, is she? Nothing's going to happen to her? Because she is a critic. Peskov, I hope British police is effective. She's living in London. Why don't you ask British authorities about her being safe or unsafe? She's not living in Moscow. Our Panorama programme gave the last word to Litvinenko's widow. Something worse can happen again. because list of these people is not finished yet. It was the second person who was killed from this list by polonium-210. Okay, what will they use to kill another person? Atomic bomb? Could you tell me, please, what's next? The answer to her question is a chemical weapon of mass destruction, but I'm getting ahead of the story. The assassination of Litvinenko got Professor Norman Dombey thinking that the Russian poison factory would not have first used polonium-210 against a target in Britain. They would have most likely tried it back in Russia first. He looked into the strange death of a Chechen fighter, Lecha Islamov, who was serving a 9-year sentence in prison in Moscow when, in April 2004, something horrible happened. Ahmed Zakayev, the former Free Chechen foreign minister, told me, the night before Islamov was due to be transferred from his holding cell in Moscow to the prison where he would serve the rest of his sentence, he had 2 visitors, FSB officers. They tried to turn him, but he refused to work for Russian intelligence. They drank tea together. Next day, he was in transit to the main prison, and he started feeling very ill. They took him to the nearest hospital in Volgograd. Islamov's lawyer described his client's condition. He cannot speak or move, has become absolutely bald, lost his hair, his beard and his eyebrows. His skin is peeling off from his head and his hands. Zakayev said Islamov's symptoms were the same as Litvinenko's, but more acute. Lecha died in 10 days. Sasha Litvinenko lasted 24 days because he was in hospital and the doctors were fighting for his life. The second poisoning that struck Professor Dombey was that of Roman Serpov, the old St. Petersburg gangster who, the story goes, once gave a stolen emerald to Vladimir Putin back in the day. Serpov had known all the deputy mayor's secrets, had reputedly taken the black cash from the grateful mob and handed it over to Putin. U.S. intelligence analyst Paul Doyle recalls that Serpov and his partner, Viktor Solotov, had a security company called Baltic Escorts. In the 1990s, they got the city contract to provide personal protection services for Mayor Sobchak and his deputy Putin. Zolotov followed Putin to Moscow as his bodyguard and has risen to the pinnacle of power as chief of Putin's Praetorian Guard, the Rosgvardia or National Guard, and is a member of the Russian National Security Council. Serpov was present for Putin's inaugural ceremony as president. But then, in the autumn of 2004, something went wrong. On the 11th of September 2004, Serpov visits colleagues at a local FSB office, where he has a cup of tea. He falls unwell, the symptoms being vomiting, diarrhea, a sudden drop of white blood cells. His hair falls out. His skin blisters. And then he dies. Professor Norman Dombey drew my attention to the following. The 3 Russians who seem to have died as a result of radiation poisoning are Yuri Shekochikin, Lecha Islamov, and Roman Serpov. And in all of the cases, it looked like radiation, but no radiation was found, just like for much of the time Litvinenko. So the official Russian verdicts were cause unknown. And that was what Putin and co. wanted in the case of Litvinenko. They wanted to show that they could assassinate without leaving any trace. It had worked 3 times before. With the 3 Russians, we can't be 100% sure that it was polonium-210, because nobody did the tests, which Aldermaston did. But the professor's logic is good. The Russians would not use a weapon of this kind against such a high-profile target in London without having tested it beforehand. 1 year after Litvinenko, who had got British citizenship by the time he was assassinated, died in agony, the British government responded by expelling 4 Russian diplomats. This was such a feeble slap on the wrist that, guess what? This wasn't the last Kremlin-sponsored assassination using weapons of mass destruction on British soil. I asked Professor Norman Dombey, did he think that the British state had been too slow to join the dots? Dombey replied, absolutely they didn't. There were so many Russian millionaires spending money in London. I don't think there is anything else. The US intelligence analyst Paul Joyle believes that Litvinenko calling Putin a paedophile was the tipping point. There were many people that wanted to get rid of Litvinenko, but if you look at the way they killed him, it was absolutely horrible. Basically, his insides melted from the polonium, and it was something that was meant not to be discovered. And they almost got away with it. Joyle's working hypothesis is that Litvinenko had sources inside the KGB who knew that when Putin was waiting for assignment overseas, there was some issue about his sex life hanging over him. Litvinenko believed the issue was that Putin was a paedophile. Joyle has another theory. I think that the evidence was that Putin had some type of sexual experience, not with children, but with young men. He's not necessarily gay. Maybe that is to put it too forcefully. With him, I suspect it's a power thing. The KGB knew this, so rather than put him overseas in the West, they decided to ship him to East Germany. I find it hard to believe if it was confirmed that he was a paedophile. If Putin was a paedophile, he would not have been posted to East Germany. Joyle believes that to state categorically that Putin is gay would be wrong, an overstatement. Even to say that he's bisexual may be too strong. I don't know whether it is a real attraction, which bisexuality implies, or it is a motivation to exercise power over a weaker individual. There are indications that Putin, when he was young, may have experienced this abuse himself. Maybe this behavior is in part revenge. I've heard of instances that indicate to me that he's more motivated by power and control than of orientation. Everyone, including Vladimir Putin, is entitled to determine their own sexual orientation. The problem arises in a country where the president, whom some sources suggest is bisexual, has essentially criminalized homosexuality. What happens next in the narrative of people who dare to make public what they knew about Vladimir Putin's private life makes one's blood run cold. Joyle set it out for me. I'd heard about the death of Alexander Litvinenko at a dinner party I was having at my home on Thanksgiving. We received the call, and in my home for the Thanksgiving meal was General Kalugin and his wife, a former foreign minister of a former Soviet republic, and a prominent Russian critic. When we found out about Alexander's death, we discussed what is to be done, and that's when I decided to work on a story that could illustrate our firm belief that the Russian government murdered him by the most horrible means possible. That's what brought me to NBC Dateline. Both Joyle and General Kalugin took part in the NBC documentary, broadcast in early 2007, when lots of conspiracy theories were still doing the rounds about how Litvinenko had died. Joyle told me the Russians were putting out a lot of disinformation related to his death, that it was Berezovsky who'd killed him, that MI5 was sick and tired of him, and they killed him. So there was a lot of confusion about who was responsible. There was even a version from the Russians that he killed himself inadvertently with polonium. I know this to be true because I had reported our BBC Panorama programme. Our conclusion was crystal clear, that Litvinenko had been murdered by the Russian secret state with a nuclear poison. But many in London and Washington, D.C. were sceptical, afraid or too alarmed to join the Black Dots. Having been to Ryazan and Chechnya in 2000, having known Anna Politkovskaya before she was murdered on Putin's birthday, I no longer gave the Kremlin any benefit of the doubt whatsoever. The NBC Dateline took the same line, that Litvinenko had been murdered by the Russian secret state. Someone else who took part in the NBC Dateline show was the Times reporter, Daniel McGrory. I knew Danny from my time on the road for The Observer as a war reporter. He was a brave and good journalist, nicknamed McGrory the Story. He'd given NBC Dateline an interview in which he'd said Litvinenko had been killed in a state-sponsored assassination. 5 days after he recorded that interview, he was found dead. Joel told me, when I mentioned that Danny had died before the airing of the program in the United States, one particular friend said, "You had better be very careful." I said, "Look, nothing's going to happen to me." A British inquest found that McGrory had died of natural causes, a brain hemorrhage, a verdict his family agreed with. The McGrory family said that they were completely satisfied by the coroner's assessment that he died of natural causes, and that their beloved husband and father was not the victim of murder. The allegation that an experienced journalist was executed by a hostile foreign power in his own country is extraordinarily serious. If it were true, it would have profound implications not just for our family, but for investigative journalists in this country and international diplomatic relations. No one would be more concerned by this than Daniel McGrory's family and friends. However, we do not believe the allegation that Daniel McGrory was assassinated by Russian agents has any basis in fact. People in the media, politics, and the wider world should think very carefully before repeating these allegations as fact or launching inquiries on the basis of evidence that is flimsy at best. I asked Paul Joyle whether Danny McGrory was killed or died of natural causes. He told me, "Well, I don't know. It's certainly an open question. I don't think it was pursued in a vigorous way to determine that question definitively. The Russian intelligence services, with their laboratories, may have perfected a number of poisons that could have caused a brain hemorrhage. If you don't start from that perspective, you will never find a subtle answer to the question, could he have been poisoned? My personal experience of the quality of investigation by British coroners is not great. Too often I have found them to be too under-resourced or too establishment-minded to place much confidence in their findings. But I cannot provide specific evidence that gainsays the coroner's verdict or the family's belief in it. They're good people, and they're bright. There is always a danger in ascribing an event to a cause without sound evidence. In philosophy, they call this a corollary, not a consequence. What really happened to Danny McGrory? To be honest, I don't know. Paul Joyle, in his extended interview with NBC Dateline before the edit, gave them his belief that the tipping point was Alexander's allegation that Putin was a paedophile in the Kremlin. That line was cut out of the broadcast. Joyle thinks that the Russians got hold of a transcript of his extended interview. He cannot explain to me exactly how he believes that is the case, but he has a solid and informed theory. He continued, 4 days after the broadcast, when I pulled into the driveway, in the darkness, in the rain, I was ambushed by 2 men waiting in the bushes for me. I confronted the first one, but I was attacked from behind. I managed to neutralize the first one after he hit me in the head from behind. I immediately turned around, faced him and counterattacked. I took him to the ground, and he said to the other guy I did not see, "Shoot him." Joyle was shot by a 9mm round, which went through his colon and bladder. They tried another shot to the head, but the gun jammed. Then his dog, all 200 pounds of him, went for the attackers, and they fled. Joyle was on a breathing tube for 30 days and had 7 operations over 3.5 years. The men who tried to kill him have never been caught. To listen more, I'm afraid, you've got to get the audiobook Killer in the Kremlin, read by me from Audible Apple Books or Google Play or other audio retailers. Thank you very much for listening to this bonus episode of Taking on Putin. For the series proper, the production in London was by Chalk and Blade. The executive producer was Laura Sheeter, with other production by the team. It was mixed and sound designed by Alex Port-Felix, with original music by Thomas Hewitt-Jones. Thank you for listening, and thank you for coming along for the ride. Take care, and love from London and Kyiv.